Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Maria Takalanda, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's online author event with none other than Sue Williams, who has written a terrific new book called Elizabeth and Elizabeth. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respect to Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. A couple of housekeeping reminders. You can participate in this live webinar by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question or comment. Keep in mind that if you're on an iPad or an iPhone, you may need to touch your screen to see the Q&A function. Please do participate. I'll be looking out for your questions and I'll leave some time at the end of my interview with Sue to put your questions to her. I'd like to remind you as well that this webinar is being recorded. So if you'd like to watch it again, or if you'd like to recommend it to family or friends, the recording will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest author, Sue Williams. Sue is so accomplished, it's going to take me a little while to introduce her. She's an award-winning journalist working in newspapers, magazines and TV in Australia, UK and New Zealand. She's also a prolific best-selling author. Her books include Getting There, Journeys of an Accidental Adventurer, the story of her travels around isolated Australia, Welcome to the Outback, and a series of other books about the outback, women in the outback, outback spirit and outback heroines. Sue has also written biographies of prominent Australians, Father Chris Riley, Father Bob Maguire, Navy diver Paul de Gelda, Fred Brophy, and Australia's youngest Everest climber, Alyssa Azar. Sue's true crime book, And Then the Darkness, The Disappearance of Peter Falconio and the Trials of Joanne Lees, was shortlisted for the International Gold Dagger Award for the world's best crime non-fiction. She has also written a children's book called Everest Dreaming. Elizabeth and Elizabeth, and yes, it's time to hold up this gorgeous book, is Sue's first novel. It's a historical novel born out of a fascination with early colonial Australian history and in particular with the women of that era. This novel is about an imagined friendship between Elizabeth Macquarie and Elizabeth Macarthur, two women whose pioneering work in colonial Australia had a significant impact on how this country evolved. One reviewer had this to say, and I love this: what Sue Williams has done with Elizabeth and Elizabeth is something that almost no author accomplishes. Write a book that will keep a general audience spellbound and give nerdy historians like me a thrill too. I'm not sure which category I actually fall into, but having probably both, but having read the novel, I can certainly attest to its appeal. It's really so fascinating and a terrific read as a work of fiction too. Sue, I thought we might begin with a little bit of a history lesson to kind of set the scene for the novel. And the novel is set at a specific juncture in Australian history, just after the so-called rum wars, in the squalor and sordidness of Sydney. So before we get into talking specifically about our two Elizabeths, tell us about colonial Australia at the time.
Sure. Well, the time I started the book is 1810, at the beginning of 1810, which is when Elizabeth Macquarie and Governor Lachlan Macquarie first arrived in Australia. And I guess back then they'd been led to believe that it was a really fabulous place because William Bligh, the governor who'd just been deposed by the Rum Rebellion, had written back letters to England telling them what a wonderful place it was. It was an oasis, it was beautiful, it was fecund, it was just a green, lush series of valleys. But in fact, when they arrived, I think they were quite horrified because the town itself was still very much a fledgling town. It was kind of really roughshod huts, very rough bark huts and really rudimentary houses. And there were no real streets or paths. It was all just kind of muddy pathways, no sewage system, obviously. The kind of town that we might imagine in our worst dreams, I suppose, really. And I think they were expecting it was going to be fantastic and there was going to be this wonderful welcome for them. But of course, there was so much uproar at the time after the Rum Rebellion. There were lots of people still very much in favour of Governor Bligh and some people still very much against him. So the whole place was just in complete and utter chaos as well. And I think they found that very, very difficult to cope with at first. At the same time, there were other people there. Elizabeth Macarthur was there. She'd been there 21 years by that point. And when she'd arrived, it was even worse. She'd lived in one of those awful bark huts just at Sydney Cove, but she'd since moved out to Elizabeth Farm in Parramatta, just about 15 k's outside Sydney. And she was kind of building a nice life there. She had a nice farm and there were lush valleys and greenery and lots of sheep out there. But the actual city of Sydney itself was a really grim place to arrive in, I think.
That certainly comes across when the Macquaries arrive and, you know, they describe rubbish everywhere and these open sewers along the street. And of course, one of the things the Macquaries do is turn that around to a considerable extent in terms of you know, how Sydney looks and how one experiences life there. The novel alternates between the two voices or the two characters of Elizabeth Macquarie, known very conveniently as Betsy, so we can distinguish them. That's very nice.
That's right.
And Elizabeth Macarthur, who, I mean, as you've said, you know, was a really quite a resilient woman, living on the land by herself for many periods of time. Well, what am I telling people about them?
No, it's good. It's good.
Tell us about these two Elizabeths. They're quite extraordinary women.
Yeah, well, they had some things in common. They were both women who had lost their families, really. Elizabeth Macquarie had lost her father at a very young age, and then she'd lost her mother as well. And she was basically looking after her sister's children. Her sister had a lot of children, and also her brother's estate in the West Highlands of Scotland. So she was kind of very much on her own. And Elizabeth Macarthur had a really quite a tragic childhood as well, because she lost her father early on and her mother remarried, and her mother's new husband didn't really want another man's child. So she was adopted out to a vicar's family. So she was a very lonely kid as well. She got on well with the vicar's children. She kind of treated them very much as brothers and sisters, but she was kind of a lone spirit. So when John Macarthur came around, he came over to give her, one of the vicar's sons, some school lessons. He started courting her and she was completely blown away by him because I suppose it was the first time that someone had really paid her an awful lot of attention. I think they always say, you know, for a child to grow up healthily, they have to be the most important person in at least one person's life. And she wasn't the most important person in her mother's life. And suddenly she became the most important person in John Macarthur's life. And he completely stole her heart very early on. And in fact, you know, she was living in this very proper vicar's family, yet she became pregnant even before they married, which must have been quite a scandal at the time. Yeah. So she was quite a headstrong young woman, completely entranced by John Macarthur. And when he announced that they were going to go to Australia to start afresh, she was really on board with that. But she'd come over to Australia on the second fleet, which everyone says is the worst fleet. And they came over on the worst ship of the worst fleet as well. And it'd been a really awful journey. She'd lost a child. They'd suffered terribly on the trip because John Macarthur, her husband, was a real firebrand, and he was always getting into trouble. He was always having arguments, and he unfortunately had a lot of arguments with the captain of their ship. So the captain of the ship took it out very much on Elizabeth and John, and so they ended up having to transfer to another ship. So it was all really, really awful. But because she'd lost children as well, Elizabeth Macquarie had also lost a child. So they kind of had an awful lot in common, I think, really. And Elizabeth Macquarie, she lost her daughter before she left for Australia. And then when she was in Australia, she had a number of miscarriages. So she was really quite devastated and really, really wanted a child. So we kind of think they had some things in common, but at other times, in other ways, they had nothing in common because their two husbands were bitter enemies because John Macarthur had helped lead the Rum Rebellion against the sitting governor. And he'd agitated against two previous governors before that. He was, a real anti-establishment man. And so Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who was a very proper person, thought John would be an enemy right from the very start. And luckily, when they arrived, the Macquaries, John Macarthur was already in England. He'd gone over there because he would have faced the gallows possibly in Australia for treason for having led the revolt against Governor Bligh. So he'd gone over to England to plead his case. So happily, they had a small period of time there where Elizabeth Macquarie could meet up with Elizabeth Macarthur. And I believe the two of them would have become friends. We don't really know. We know that they had something in common. They'd met before in England before they'd come over to Australia when Elizabeth Macquarie was a young girl, because there were 21 years difference in their age. Elizabeth Macarthur was 21 years older. So they'd met before, and we know that they met a few times in Sydney, but we don't really know very much beyond then. But if they were friends, they would have had to hide their friendship because it wouldn't have been politic to have become friends because their enemies were their husbands were such bitter enemies. So they would have had to hide it, really.
Absolutely. And one of the things too that comes across particularly early in their friendship, you've talked to some extent about their similarities, but the first thing that we become aware of when they meet are their differences. They're two quite different women in their roles in society, in their jobs, but also in the paths that they pave, the things that they achieve as women. And I'm wondering, in terms of their accomplishments, which I'll ask you to talk about, was that what attracted you to them as a writer? What was it? Why these two women? Why are they the subject of this book?
Well, I guess we're all very familiar with Elizabeth Macarthur. She's a legend, I think. And we know quite a lot about her. We don't know so much about her background, really, but we know that she achieved an awful lot because she was out here and she lived in the wilds of Parramatta for much of the time. And then she lived in southwest Sydney, where they had an awful lot of their sheep. And her husband, John Macarthur, was back in England for 2 long periods. He was over in England the first time because he'd become involved in a duel with his commanding officer, and he'd actually done quite well in the duel and injured his commanding officer, but that's not a good look for a soldier. So he'd gone back to England the first time to try and protest his innocence that time. Then he'd gone back again after the Rum Rebellion to protest his innocence there and to say that William Bligh was a terrible man and he was just leading a revolt for the sake of Australians, really. So Elizabeth Macarthur was on her own a lot of the time. She was left with her daughters because he took the sons over to England for their education. But she managed everything on her own. She had convicts and she had servants, but she was a woman just, there doing her best. And she did some amazing things. Today we look back and think maybe they're not so extraordinary, but back at that time, she came up with the idea of, she was the first one to come up with the idea of washing the sheep's fleeces. I don't know what the plural of fleece is. But when they were being shipped over to London, at the auction houses, they were saying there's just too many burrs and twigs and stones in the fleece. So they were much heavier and they were getting a much lower price for the wool. So she came up with the idea of washing the sheep while their fleeces were still on them, which was quite revolutionary. She would run them into a stream, And then a group of men would wash, and she would join in often, would wash the sheep as the stream ran over them. And she also came up with the idea of guarding the sheep by night, to have shepherds on night shift. I suppose, it seems so obvious now, but back then there were lots of dingoes, there were dogs, wild dogs, and also Aboriginal people would come and, steal sheep as well, because there were droughts all the time in Sydney, even back then. And people would go very hungry. And obviously the Aboriginal people had been shifted off their traditional hunting grounds, so they were often very hungry as well. So she was out there, this pioneer woman doing great stuff. And then Elizabeth Macquarie arrives. And she's kind of a gentlewoman. She hasn't had much experience of the world. She's grown up in this tiny place in the Highlands of Scotland. She's been down to London for her education, but she's not really been anywhere else. And she arrives, and I think Elizabeth Macarthur thinks of her as a bit of a privileged kind of gentlewoman, and, kind of quite despises her in some ways. But Elizabeth Macquarie eventually wins her round, because the two women do discover, that they've got a lot in common, and it's really hard for women in those days. And there weren't any obvious women friends for them apart from each other. So they kind of would have bonded, I think, over those common interests. And I think we just don't know very much about Elizabeth Macquarie, but she was quite an amazing woman for her time as well. She was really interested in architecture. When she came over to Australia, she brought all these pattern books with her, kind of architectural books, because she was determined that the new colony would be, a place of magnificence and a place of grandeur. She never quite achieved that, but it certainly became much more of a place of order under her and Lachlan Macquarie. So she managed to achieve quite an enormous amount of stuff as well. I mean, she was the first one who suggested to Lachlan that the place be called Australia rather than New South Wales or New Holland, which was also fashionable in those days. And she kind of courted controversy in lots of ways. She was the first to invite convicts into Government House. She invited them in for a big feast for helping with the renovation of Government House and its grounds. She didn't really realise, I don't think at the time, that it would have been such a shocking thing for the rest of Australia to witness, because she was very much with her husband. Do stop me if I'm going on.
No. It's fascinating. And I hope maybe in talking about their support for emancipated convicts, I mean, do you think it has something to do with their Scottish background? In fact, I remember a particular passage in the novel that alludes to a very different point of view when it comes to the reformation of criminals.
That's right.
So maybe you could, that'd be terrific if you would keep talking about that.
Well, another bit of division between the two women was the fact that the Macquaries were emancipists, as you say, and they believed very much that once a convict had served their time, they should have exactly the same rights as free settlers. Or if they proved themselves very, very good or very helpful, or provided certain favours, they could get a free pardon, and then they could just come and be free people, and they could be promoted to positions of responsibility in the colony. They could become police officers or magistrates. They could do all sorts of things. Whereas the other side of the argument were the exclusivists, and the Macarthurs were very much in this camp. And they were the group of free settlers who believed very much that once a convict, always a convict. You had the stain of convict inheritance on you. You should never have the same rights as free settlers. And so there was this big division between the two groups. And often the free settlers wanted free labour. They wanted the convicts to work for them. They wanted them to look after their sheep and do errands for them. They didn't want to have to pay. They wanted them to clear their land. There were all sorts of jobs that they wanted them for. So that was a huge division between the two. And the Macquaries were Presbyterians, and they'd grown up in Scotland, which had the Highland clearances. And in Scotland, in the early days, a lot of the big lairds who owned lots of land tried to clear the small family tenant farmers off their land, so they could actually farm sheep as well. In the same way that the situation has happened here too. And I think they saw the misery of those Highland clearances, and they felt very strongly that people had a right to a decent life. And if they could prove that they earned it, then they should be given that kind of life. And I think that influenced their attitude towards Aboriginal people as well, because they could see the Aboriginal people have been cleared off their lands, and they felt genuinely quite sad for them. I mean, you know, in those days, it was a very kind of patriarchal kind of paternal kind of way. I mean, Lachlan Macquarie would go around to Aboriginal colonies, and he would present them with prizes and medals and thank them, you know, if they'd been kind of good citizens. But of course, the one thing that really blotted his time in Australia was a terrible massacre at Appin. And, you know, there's obviously no excuse for that. It was a horrendous thing. He'd been put under a lot of pressure by the free settlers, people like the Macarthurs, when Aboriginal raids on their farms had taken casualties and they'd lost too many sheep and they'd lost buildings and they started losing lives as well. He sent some groups of soldiers out to round up some of the Aboriginal people with instructions that if they surrendered, they would be captured and they wouldn't be shot. But in fact, the soldiers who'd gone out, they lost their tracker, and then they panicked when they came across an Aboriginal camp and started firing indiscriminately. And 14 people lost their lives, women and children among them. And that was a terrible thing. And the blame had to be sheeted back to Lachlan Macquarie because he was the governor and he was the commander of the forces. So he took responsibility for that. But one imagines from studying his attitudes that would have been a very, very sad day for him as well. That would have been very hard.
Absolutely. Look, it's hard to read that in the novel. It's impossible not to show the reality of what happened. But you know, there's some tough passages of reading in there. I mean, it's clear that you've done an extraordinary amount of research for the novel, which is necessary for a historical novel. But in the way that you imagine Elizabeth and Elizabeth as friends who visit each other in the fledgling colony and who go on to exchange letters when Elizabeth Macquarie returns to the United Kingdom, were there actual diaries and letters written by the two women that you were able to draw from, not only for information, but for coming to imagine or to hear their voices?
Yep, there were letters, not necessarily between them, because we haven't found any letters between them. And we kind of think if there were any letters, they would have destroyed them because it would have been too damaging for both their husbands. But yes, Elizabeth Macarthur constantly wrote letters to her husband, John, when he was away, and he wrote letters back. And they often talked about the Macquaries in those letters. So that's a fantastic record. And also Mrs. Macquarie often wrote letters to various dignitaries, people around the world, but she destroyed most of her letters that she'd written to Lachlan Macquarie in the early days because she was very, very private. So, but we get a very good sense of her voice from some of those letters, her passion for the new Australia, her passion for architecture, her keenness to try and leave a legacy in the colony, you know, leave it a much better place than when she arrived. So you do get a very distinct impression of their personalities. And then, you know, as a writer, I tried to draw very much out their differences and also their similarities and imagine how they would have related to each other. Because that's really important for me. And it's interesting because, you know, you look at history and you kind of think, well, where are all the women? And often, you know, the men have the positions of power and authority, and all the historians are male as well. So that's why women just don't get much of a Guernsey. But in those days, women led the same lives as their husbands. You know, Elizabeth Macquarie travelled around the country just as Lachlan Macquarie had. I mean, she was the first white woman to cross over from the Blue Mountains around outside Sydney. She was the first white woman to travel in many places and often just on horseback. And Elizabeth Macarthur was often the first woman to do an awful lot of things as well. But they were very much hidden behind the glow of their husbands. In fact, when you look into it a great deal, you start realizing that they actually had an awful lot to say, and they had a lot of power and authority as well. But it's just not publicly noticed.
No, absolutely. And this segues perfectly into my next question, Sue, which is about the general invisibility or the traditional invisibility of women when it comes to history, which is typically about men, in part because they had more agency in the public arena in the past. But what happens when we shift the focus from men to women? What happens? What different perspective on history does that give us? And I'm going to quote from Michelle Scott Tucker here, who's the author of Biography of Elizabeth Macarthur, and I know you list that at the back of the
fantastic book, yeah.
She said, and this is a quote, "One of the problems of being a researcher of women's history is all the dead children."
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely. Because when you read the history of men, you never hear about their children, and you certainly never hear about the missing children. But when you start looking at the women, I mean, the tragedies they went through, it's just absolutely horrific. I mean, both of them losing so many children at various junctures, and yet having to just pick themselves up and get on with it. And it was really interesting with Elizabeth Macquarie, because she didn't understand why she had so many miscarriages, and she really despaired of ever being able to give Lachlan a child. And Lachlan had been married once before, and his wife had died of TB very young. And I think she was very much his real first love and his real passion in life. And I think Elizabeth Macquarie always felt a little bit overshadowed by his first wife. In fact, they called their first child, who died at the age of 3 months, they called her Jane, after the name of his wife. He called his estate in Scotland after the name of his first wife, Jarvisfield. And so always she was kind of under that shadow, and that would have been really hard to cope with. So I think when we write about women, it's fantastic, because we maybe only have the dry, dusty bones of history to work on. But once you start looking at women's lives, you really put flesh and blood on those bones and emotion. And their emotions would have been, losing a child will be exactly the same as our emotions today. And so we can really relate to that. And I think that for me is the joy of historical fiction, is being able to bring those women to life, and hopefully that we can recognize something of ourselves in them, and we can really start to feel their pain, and we can feel their triumph, and we can really become involved and enmeshed in their lives in a way you can't really when you're writing straight biography. Because I've written biography, non-fiction biography, and that's been great. And often the people have been still living, which really helps. But when you fictionalize something, you can just add a little bit extra to a story, which I just really love. I mean, there are fiction writers who add an awful lot to stories, and I think it can distort it. And there's another discussion about historical fiction, at one end of the range, where you completely make up characters and you make up affairs and you make up, marriages and things for people which didn't really exist. And then the kind of historical fiction I really like, where there's a kernel of truth there. Well, I'd say there's 85% truth and just maybe 15% of on the top of kind of embellishing and trying to bring it alive for the reader.
Well, look, you're not going to believe this, Sue, but you've provided another perfect segue into a question. But this time it's not my question. This time it's a question from our audience. And I actually don't have the name of this person with the question, but the question is, and it speaks directly to this business of non-fiction and fiction, because I think you're being asked to take a leap of the imagination. What do you think Elizabeth Macquarie and Elizabeth Macarthur would be doing career-wise in today's world?
A great question. Well, I think Elizabeth Macquarie was a really frustrated architect. She first met Lachlan Macquarie after she designed a little path running past her house. He said it was a charming little path, and who designed it? And she said it was her. And she was really keen. When she came here, she designed the female orphans building, which was along the lines of her own house. And she had a real hand in many of the big, fine sandstone structures we have in Sydney still standing today. So I think she would have been an architect. Elizabeth Macarthur, I think she kind of probably could have turned her hand to anything she wanted. She was such a practical, resilient woman. She could have been an engineer. She could have been a politician, maybe. Yeah. Or maybe she could have just been a sheep farm owner.
That's right.
I suppose. There's probably a better word for a sheep farm owner. Maybe a wool farmer. Maybe that's what it would be.
And I hope our audience feels encouraged to start posting more questions in the Q&A, because I am paying attention. I am waiting for them. And Sue is keen to answer your questions too. And I have to say, I expect to receive questions from our audience in Geelong, given that we have our own two famous female sheep farmers here. Well, we did have in colonial times, and Drysdale and Newcombe suburbs are named after those two pioneering sheep farmers, squatters in this region. So looking forward to some more questions, but I do have another one for you, Sue, in the meantime. Look, you're a bit of a machine when it comes to writing. And I know that's true of a lot of journalists. You have to be, you work constantly to deadlines. But you've said that it took you 5 years to write this novel, much longer than with your previous books. And I'm wondering, what were the challenges with this historical novel?
I think when I started out, I thought it was going to be kind of easy, because when you write nonfiction, you do lots of research and you interview lots of people, and everything has to be absolutely so. And I kind of thought, how much harder can it be to make up stuff? And in fact, it really is incredibly hard. It's really almost impossible. So first of all, I had the problem of research. And I kept thinking, well, you can probably hear from my accent, I'm English originally. I've only been here 31 years. I'm sorry, I've got a cat walking past my computer now. And, I kind of felt that I had the disadvantage of not really knowing very much about early colonial Australian history. But then I discovered that not an awful lot of Australians know very much about early colonial history either. So it was kind of a really joint learning process. But then, of course, you've got one woman's history, then another woman's history, and then both their husband's history as well. So it can be, I found it really hard meshing them all together. And as you said in your introduction, you've got two Elizabeths. And luckily, Elizabeth Macquarie was often called Betsy by her husband. So that was a good way of distinguishing them. But trying to find the exact voices, and I think you tend to end up doing too much research, and then you get a little bit bogged down in the history. So you kind of have to then start stripping back out the research, because I think the most important thing is that a book has to really engross people and entertain them. And at the same time, I love it when you're learning something, but you don't really actually realize you're learning it. So you just kind of learn it by osmosis. And I think that's what I was really trying to aim for. And it just took a lot of goes, really. And, you know, I did a non-fiction book immediately after this book. And it was a really difficult book because the main person had just died. And the other person that I was writing about didn't speak any English, and she was in Ethiopia. And I couldn't go to Ethiopia, so we did the whole book by Zoom. But in fact, it was so much easier than the fiction. I thought, wow, why am I doing fiction? This is so hard. But it really gets under your skin. And I really loved it. And I became really passionate about the book. And you know, I think every book you write, you're very nervous about the reaction to it. And I was really worried that it wouldn't work. But people have been very kind and very generous about the book. And I've had some great feedback, and it's been really, really lovely. And I'm really happy that I've done it, really. Oh my God, sorry, it's a cat coming. Go away. Sorry.
Well, Sue, there's more great feedback coming in for you now. Glenda is saying, did so love your novel. Couldn't leave it. Thank you. So that's from Glenda here in
Oh,
Geelong.
that's
So
great. Thank you, Glenda. That's fantastic.
positive feedback for this foray into the historical novel, Sue. Look, I'm wondering, in terms of how challenging this might have been to write, one of the things that struck me
Sorry.
as being potentially troubling was how to recognise a First Nations voice or viewpoint when it comes to colonial history, while also presenting a novel from the perspective of European women living in colonial Australia. I mean, there's two quite different perspectives there, and yet for us here and now, it's kind of impossible not to look at it, through two sets of eyes, if you like. So, I mean, how did you manage that struggle as a writer?
That was a real balance, especially, sorry, especially because of the massacre, which was an horrendous blot on Australia's history. But you kind of have to recognise that those times were different. I mean, obviously, you could never justify anything like that, but they had a different attitude towards Aboriginal people then. And it would be unwise to pretend that those colonial people were incredibly sympathetic and actually understood Aboriginal people and their really strong connection to the land and to their culture, because they had absolutely no idea. I think they kind of at best treated Aboriginal people like willful children in some ways, and that was the kindest they ever were to them, really. But at the same time, we know that Lachlan Macquarie and Elizabeth Macquarie bitterly regretted the massacre and really tried to make up for it afterwards as well. I mean, both of them did an awful lot for Aboriginal people. We kind of don't think of it like that now. I mean, they took some Aboriginal kids away from their parents, which we would think is terrible today. But they kind of thought they were doing them good. They gave them a bit of an education. They gave them some training. So they thought they were doing the right thing. And they were coming from a position of real ignorance about Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal history and their ways of life. So it is really hard. But when I wrote the chapter about the massacre, I was very careful in how I wrote it. And I asked an Aboriginal historian to read it for me to check that it was accurate, the language was accurate. I mean, there was some really awful language used towards Aboriginal people, and I couldn't bring myself to use that kind of language. But I used language that I wouldn't use about Aboriginal people that was commonplace in those times as well. So it's all very much about getting a balance. And the Aboriginal historian made a couple of little changes and basically said, I think you've done a good job of getting a really balanced view. So I was really happy about that, because, you don't want to disrespect Aboriginal people. You don't want to make, the early colonialists out to be better people than they were, but you want to treat people fairly. So yes, that was very hard. Yeah, and it was very grueling reading the stuff about the massacre. It was just horrendous.
Yes, absolutely. That research would have been grueling indeed. This leads us to a question now from Sarah. What main historical resources did you draw upon when writing the book?
Okay, there was in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, there's a lot of records about the Macquaries, obviously, and about the Macarthurs. Their letters were really valuable to me. And other people had written books about the Macarthurs particularly. There was a lot of books about Lachlan Macquarie, but not very much about Elizabeth Macquarie. But then going through her letters as well, there was a great book written by a guy called Robin Walsh who'd gone through her letters and kind of translated them in some ways and drawn out some particularly relevant contemporary points. So it kind of went through a huge amount of history, I think. A lot of people have talked about the Macquaries in retrospect, about the history and their legacy for Australia today. So yeah, there's an awful lot of stuff out there. You could carry on I could have done research for 20 years and never written another word. So it's always a bit of a balance. It's really quite hard. You do far too much research. I mean, my my study is just there, and it's just still boxes overflowing of books and papers and documents and things, and I can't bear to move them really just yet. So just in case you ask me a really hard question, I can go and scurry and look up something.
I wonder, actually, given the rigor and slog of research, as you've just described it, if you didn't, at some level, really enjoy the freedom, the lure of the fictional aspect of your project, that allowed you to give some range to your imagination.
Sure. Well, absolutely. But I kind of think for a first novel, this was a really ambitious venture. And I might have been much better off, and it would have been much easier if I'd have written a contemporary novel and made it completely up. That would have been fantastic. But as it was, you kind of do use a lot of imagination, but at the same time, you're really trapped. If you're trying to make it real as well, you're really trapped within the confines of history and what history has taught us about these people. So you can't really move too far away without distorting everything, I think. So, I think I was unwise and I picked a really hard novel to start with, but now I'm hooked, sadly. I mean, I was talking to someone and they were saying, will you do a contemporary one? I said, well, maybe one day, but maybe another historical fiction first, because I do love the form. I mean, I love books by people like Philippa Gregory, Meg Keneally, great stuff. And Australian early colonial history is so fascinating. You look at the history then, and it has so many echoes of times now. This emancipist, exclusivist divide, we still have big divides between the Labour Party and the Liberal, is kind of how it kind of came from there. We still have huge political debates. We still have women perhaps not achieving their full potential in the society today. We still have many of the same issues that they had in those days, really.
Well, look, there's so much of interest and relevance in this novel. I've asked you about the challenges of writing this book, but it struck me that you had at least one advantage when it came to writing about these two women. Like them, you came from the UK, as you already noted. And did you draw on that background at all in imagining how these two women might have experienced Australia when they arrived? I remember there's a scene very early on when Elizabeth Macquarie lands here, and she's struck by the quality of the sunlight, the bright.
Absolutely.
That's something you maybe drew from your own experience.
Sure. Yeah, no, quite. Because I came over here, and I was actually the same age as Elizabeth Macquarie when she came here too. I mean, it's just, it's a silly little coincidence, really.
Nice.
But it gave me some kind of comfort in my dark days. And so, yes, and I went back over to Britain, and I spent some time in Scotland, and I went to look at her house in Aids. And the owner of the house was very generous in letting me go and have a look around. And then I looked at the Macquarie's estate in Jarvisfield and had a look. And it's been renovated now, but I imagine what it would have been like when they finally left New South Wales and they went back to Scotland. They'd gone back under a cloud because a Royal Commission had said that Lachlan Macquarie hadn't been the best of governors, and Lachlan Macquarie had really argued vehemently against that. But when they went back to Britain, having been the governor and his wife being in a really privileged position, they'd invested a lot of money into the estate on the Isle of Mull. And when they arrived back, they discovered that nearly all the money was lost because the brother had bought lots of land with the money Lachlan had sent over, but the land was worthless because it was completely barren. And none of the tenant farmers there had paid any rent for a long, long time. So they were quite ruined. And they moved into his estate, which was a really kind of rickety old, almost a castle, kind of mansion. But the north wind would come through the gaps in the brickwork. The rain would come in through the front door. It was just a really horrendous return to Britain. And they kind of imagined coming back in this blaze of glory. And in fact, it was a really ignominious end for their story. It was just, and going back there and seeing how cold Scotland can get in the winter, You think, wow, coming back from Australia into this would have been so hard. So that was great because it really gave you that amazing contrast. And so, yes, you're right. It was a big advantage for me. It was fantastic to be able to compare the two countries in that way.
Terrific. We have a comment here related to visiting relevant historic sites, I think, from Trisha. Looking forward to reading your novel. I have enjoyed visiting EM's Balgenie Farm in Camden, New South Wales.
Sure.
And also EM is remembered at the Elizabeth Macarthur Agricultural Institute there. Do you have any comments, please? That's from Patricia.
Well, there's lots of fantastic places you can still visit today, which there's Camden Park open, which is kind of Elizabeth Macarthur's second home after Elizabeth Farm, that John Macarthur built as a really grand folly for her. That opens once a year. The descendants of the Macarthurs open that up for people. And Elizabeth Farm is a fabulous place, heritage listed over in Parramatta, and that's a really beautiful place too. And then the Government House in Parramatta. And yes, I'm going over to Camden in 2 weeks and giving a talk there. And I'm just really looking forward to sort of going back there again, especially not wandering around in a panic about what I was going to write. Now I can go back thinking, oh, well, good. I've written the book, but then I'll just be panicking about what I'm going to say in the talk. Pathetic, I know, but yeah, it always happens.
I think you'll be just fine, Sue. You're doing just fine tonight, that's for sure. Patricia just finishes off here by saying that she's always admired Lachlan Macquarie's achievements, so it will be good to know Betsy Macquarie, and you do get a beautiful sense of who Betsy Macquarie may have been from this novel. I want to return to this business of you being an import.
Sure. Sorry.
So am I. So, but look, you've written so many books about Australia, and I wonder if it's been kind of like your pathway to understanding your adopted country. And if that's the case, what have you come to understand about Australia? What can you tell us about ourselves?
Well, I think Australia is a fabulous country. And not just because COVID has been such an amazing place to spend in COVID. I think England, when I look back, I mean, it was always in my youth so straight-laced kind of straight-jacketed by the class system, which is still just as strong today. And it's really hard sometimes to get to achieve things on your own merits. But in Australia, the notion of a fair go, which was started by Lachlan Macquarie, is still really strong. And I mean, of course, it's still really hard for people of colour and people from disadvantaged backgrounds to really make their way in life. But generally, it's so much easier here because people are very keen to give you a go. And I think if I'd have stayed in England, I don't know if I was a journalist in England as well, but I don't know if I would have ever been able to make the leap to being an author, because you tend to have the right connections. Whereas here, somebody said to me, well, I'd really like you to write this book, have a go. And I wrote the book, and then the next book followed, and people were just very open, I think, in a really lovely way. I mean, I love Britain. It's my second home now. And every time I go back there, I kind of feel very English, but whenever I come back to Australia, I feel very Australian all over again. And I remember having friends visit from England during the Rugby World Cup when it was here, and they were horrified that I was supporting Australia. Of course, why wouldn't I? My God. And unfortunately, when it looked like England was going to do really well, I gave away my tickets to the final because I couldn't bear to see if we lost. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic place, and I've been really lucky to be a journalist here. You get an opportunity to travel quite widely, and you mentioned the Outback books that I've done. I think I was given the first Outback book because I'd written a story about Outback women in Woman's Weekly magazine, and a publisher had seen it and asked me if I'd be interested. And I said, look, I don't know anything about the Outback. I'm from a city, and I'm not even from a city in Australia. And they said, no, we think that might be an advantage because you're kind of a fish out of water and you'll be able to see things in a fresh way. So that was really interesting. So I traveled a lot around the Outback for a series of books. And then I ended up traveling around and writing about my experiences there for one of the books as well. And I think they kind of thought it would be funny because I'm the most unlikely Outback person you could ever imagine. I mean, I don't drink, I don't eat meat. Yeah, I'm just pathetic, really. I'd go to a place and I'd stay on a cattle property and I'd have to eat cheese because they didn't have anything else to feed me, and and they'd kind of look at me with real horror. And I went cattle droving. I'd never been on a horse before, and that was one of the worst experiences of my life. I went and fought at Fred Brophy's Outback boxing tent because I didn't quite realize how horrible that was going to be until I got in the ring and started being beaten up really badly. But all those kind of things. Sometimes if you're really innocent about things and you just plunge into them, and sometimes hopefully you kind of come out alive, I suppose, most of the time.
Alive, but even more than that, I think it's quite often the outsider who brings the insights, and I think that that's certainly true of your work. We have another anonymous question here related to your work. Generally speaking, you have written books in so many different genres: biographies, non-fiction, true crime, and now historical fiction. What do you think is a common theme that ties your works together? Is there something beyond the Australian there?
I was looking at some of my books the other day, and I think they tend to be all about people, and they tend to be about people who have kind of overcome some odds, and they're really achieving stuff for the good of humanity, really. Like I wrote the book about Father Bob Maguire, the Catholic priest who I think we all know and all absolutely love. And I mean, he comes from a real battling background, and he's achieved so much really for other people. Also, the priest, Father Chris Riley, did similarly. And Outback women have done amazing things. They've overcome extraordinary odds to achieve things, both for their families and themselves, and for the country as well. Who else would go to some of those really remote places and make a go of it and kind of catch crocodiles and all the kind of amazing, crazy things that these women do? And they show such courage and fortitude and resilience. And they all have incredible setbacks. Out in the Outback, people die quite regularly because they're out in planes, the planes crash, they're in cars, they drive long, long distances, and lots of family members get killed. But these women just pick themselves up and just carry on. And I think a lot of the books that I've written have been about those kind of people. And it's fantastic to observe that and to be part of their lives just for a short period, because you really think, wow, if they can achieve these amazing things, it's up to all of us. And you see some people, they face terrible trials and they kind of shrink and they almost disappear. And other people really rise to the challenge and overcome the odds. And, you never know how people are going to react when they're really tested. But it's really interesting to see people when they're at that point, when they decide whether they're going to overcome or whether they're just going to kind of fade away. I did a book about Paul de Gelda, who was a shark attack victim who lost an arm and a leg to a terrible shark attack. And when he came back from hospital, he said he sat in his room and for the first time, because he'd been in hospital, he had nurses to help him, and he realized he couldn't open a jar properly. And he sat there and cried and cried and cried on the edge of his bed, and then thought, either I can carry on and be a pathetic victim all my life, or I can get on and get up and get over this and get out there and live my life. And he made the decision for the latter. And I mean, he's an incredible young man. He travels the world now, well, not quite at the moment with the pandemic, but
Yeah.
he's been traveling the world. He lives mostly in the States. He's appeared in movies. He's an ambassador for sharks. He talks about wildlife conservation. You know, he's a superstar, really, and he's created that life for himself. And it's so rewarding and aspirational to see these people. And I just love writing about them because it's fantastic to share their stories. You know, it's a real privilege to be in that position.
And it's fantastic to read their stories too. And I wonder if there's another inspiring character out there that's inspiring another book from you. I mean, what's next for you, Sue? I have to say that when I came to the notes section at the end of the book, one particular character stood out for me, Dr. James Barry.
Oh,
An intriguing figure gets a mention there.
sure. That's right.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about Dr. James Barry, and if perhaps
Sure.
James might be the subject of a forthcoming book?
Well, the enemy of the whole story was a man called Commissioner John Bigg, who was sent out by the British government to have a commission of inquiry into the new colony. And they kind of felt, there was a group of people who very much felt that Lachlan Macquarie was building fine buildings in Australia, and Australia wasn't a place for fine buildings. Australia was just the place for a dumping ground for convicts, and England wanted it to be a cheap place. They could bring in the wool, they could bring in the timber, and they didn't have to spend much money on it. And I think because Lachlan was so determined to turn it into a good colony, they felt he was spending too much money. And when the Commissioner John Bigg came over, he was very much in with John Macarthur and the enemies of the establishment. He accepted gifts from them, and he went round asking questions. And his first question was always, "Do you have a complaint to make against Governor Macquarie?" And he refused to accept evidence under oath, even though he was a lawyer. So it was a really unusual thing. So it was kind of, the odds were stacked against Lachlan. So John Bigg really kind of did Australia a huge disservice. But when he went back to Britain, he did various things. And then he had a bad fall from a horse, and he was treated by a doctor called James Barry. And James Barry turned out to be a woman in disguise, which was quite amazing. But women in those days weren't allowed to be doctors. So if you were a woman and you had some medical acumen, then the only way to do anything would be to disguise yourself as a man and then continue to be a doctor under false pretenses. So she actually was an extraordinary person. So yeah, that's a very good point. But in fact, I am writing another historical fiction. I haven't started yet, but it is of a person in the book, and I thought you were gonna say that person. But
I didn't guess.
But maybe James Barry is a better idea. I don't know now. But there's a woman called Mary Putland in the book, who's the daughter of Captain Bligh, and she was quite remarkable because lots of people disliked her because she was vain and flirtatious and wore very fashionable clothes, and people thought she was a bit silly and pretentious. But at the same time, she was really sparky. And when the Rum rebels marched on Government House and William Bligh was hiding under his bed to try and escape from them, she was the person standing at the front gates of Government House trying to beat back all these rebels who had their guns. They were all armed and loaded. She tried to fight them back with her parasol. So she was quite a pretty, sparky lady, really. And so I'm going to be writing about her, I think, for the next book.
She sounds great. There are so many women who haven't yet been written about. History is full of opportunities for writing terrific historical fiction.
Yeah, and I think a lot of women now are writing historical fiction about other women, and it's just great. It's a real treasure trove of precious gems. It's just amazing. These women were quite stunning, really. Their achievements and the odds that they fought all the time, and it's a real privilege to be able to kind of dip into their lives and and hopefully bring them to life again, really. It's great.
Well, I'm certainly happy to hear that you're writing another historical novel, but another audience member is as well. I've just heard from Christine, who says, none of your research was wasted, Sue. Nuanced, rich and sensory details brought this novel to life with its unique perspective on these two women. More historical fiction, please.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
You're delivering on what we want.
That's fantastic. That's very kind. It's very generous.
No, it's absolutely true. We are starting to run out of time. We've hit 8:30. I can't see any other questions here right now, so maybe it's probably time to start the signing off routine now, which I'd like to begin by thanking Sue for joining us tonight. Thank you, Sue, for your time and insights.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Maria, and thanks so much for listening, everyone. That's great.
Oh, what a pleasure. And indeed, thanks to our wonderful audience. Someone thanking you in the comments as well, Sue, for tonight. Thanks to our wonderful audience. I should tell you that both hard copies and electronic copies of Elizabeth and Elizabeth are available to borrow from Geelong Regional Libraries, though I have been told there are already 14 holds in place for the copies available. So
great.
An in-demand book already. Published by Allen and Unwin, Elizabeth and Elizabeth is also available to purchase through their website or from any of Geelong's fantastic bookshops. So just checking here on the comments, getting some terrific feedback for you, Sue. So thank you very much again. Thanks to the audience. And I'll be signing off now on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and farewell, good night.